I think that we do work with the students, particularly Marrikka, as in her role here at SCI-Arc, is we are working with the students throughout the summer to kind of practice their argument, to kind of put it in context of the sort of observations that they've made, the kind of obsessions that they've developed, and certainly give them some context for that. But I do think that when they present it to the jury, I often find that students, even though they've had some of those more targeted conversations, they tend to edit out some of the super specifics, and so it's
like, where's the site? What's the program?
What's the program? How big is it? Why did you do it? Sometimes those things are
I think all students think we can read their minds, and that they don't. Some of the things are so obvious to them that they think they don't have to tell us, that they don't have to point to the program or the site.
That's true.
And so, but I do. The projects are very personal. I find personal in the sense of, did you use the word obsession?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, from perfume bottles and to blue cubes to the ones we saw today were very personal, and not presented as an argument, as you said, presented as observations or almost commentary rather than an argument.
Or a critique, which I think some of the jury's been looking for a critique, and the students say, well, I don't see it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I find, so a couple things that I like about one of the things that is hard about these kinds of reviews is the work that is then foisted upon the jury. So the jury is then expected to, on the spot, as you said, theorize, or at least discursify a set of objects, or an object, or an artifact, or a presentation, or an image, or whatever that they've never seen before. And then a conversation actually happens. This is what I like. I like the fact that then a conversation can emerge. Discourse is actually made. And I feel like the student is in a way being very honored by the jury that is telling them, this could mean this is part of that, here's this, and so it's almost like discourse is being formed around the student, who is almost a kind of privileged observer to that. So I think I like, once I figured out that was kind of the way SCI-Arc did it when I first came here, it made me feel like, actually I like that. I like that the student does the work up to that moment and then hands the work off to the jury.
I also feel like the work is very much in the world. Most of the projects are feel very contemporary in different ways. Either just purely visually, but also thematically and technically, of course. The other thing is, I think certainly in my school, I think a lot of schools, if you don't talk about climate change or social equity or something like that, it doesn't get taken as seriously. Whereas these students are absolutely free to explore very focused, non-social issues, purely formal, but also completely social, non-formal, right? And they're allowed to explore all that.
Yeah, and one thing that I think that brings up, I'm really glad you said that. You made that observation. You said it out loud. Is that it makes it. We are, in fact, holding a position as a school that there is no such thing as the merely formal. That form and architectural considerations are, in fact, they already have social values attached to them, and that work has social relevance.
Well, I think that's a great point. And one thing that came up in this, we were just looking at this last project. Actually, I don't know if you can see behind us, but and it was a very particular take on Paris, but it wasn't really about Paris, and it's a collection of perfume bottles and mirrors and cast resin miniature models of the city, and we got into a conversation about, is this really a city, is this not a city, is this architecture, what does this mean for architecture? And Tom Main made a comment at the end. He said, this is really about you as an architect setting out on a path and learning to ask questions and see things in a different way. So whatever we think of this project, maybe that's the most valuable thing you'll take away. It's like you were presented with problem A and actually realized problem C is really what's interesting here, and I've completely flipped the kind of way that we're going to even think about what a city means altogether, and that's what I think, this idea that form is not just form, right? Like, it allows you to access all kinds of other sets of ideas, and that as architects, that's what we do, right? Is we try to look at things in different ways. I think we're, at least the institutions I'm at too, there's a kind of crisis a little bit about what is an architect? What should architects be doing? Should we be solving all the problems of climate change? Should we be making sparkly, glitter-clad buildings, right?
It's bedazzled.
I do see certain trends. One definitely is, I don't know how to call it, the array or the scatter or but often there's a kind of project that is an inventory. I mean, the one that you just mentioned about Paris was a kind of inventory, but there are other inventories of like, you know, modes of glitch or certain materials or certain shapes or an inventory of things that the software does collected as objects, right? That I think is somehow, I don't know how to read it symptomatically, but it's somehow an attempt to map and inventory a certain condition that they think is important, whether it's a condition of software or a condition of consumption or a condition of technology, to map it, inventory it, and perhaps thereby, just by sheer document, by sheer putting it in a frame, start to understand it. And I think it's a very interesting, if thought of symptomatically, it means that something at this moment, there are many questions that they don't yet have ways even to frame theoretically yet.
One of the reasons I think that might happen is because, I mean, I think all of us believe here that in our own ways and in everyone's own profession and discipline, we should work on the current problems of today. But I do think as a school that says you have to kind of think beyond that, you have to think beyond the problems that other people give you to solve, and you have to be confident as a designer to really, I think, take a risk and say, I'm really interested in this, in X. And so I think in doing that, we're still asking a student who's kind of at the beginning of their career to make a huge risk. And so I think sometimes that kind of inventory is a way to kind of bolster information around something that they're like, okay, so this is, you know, I'm taking a risk. Am I going to be able to make a connection in this amount of time that will be robust enough within the discipline and within the conversation I want to have? I hope so. I'm going to aim for that. But in the meantime, I'm also going to make sure that I produce a range of ways to look at and think about that problem. So I think it's, in some ways, it's a bit of generosity, I think, on the student's part, but I think it's also a bit of a way of, we all do it in our own way, to sort of, when you take risk, you balance that risk with something.
I found a kind of confidence. I don't mean an amount of confidence, I mean a certain type of confidence that I would call it confident to have a singular theme, confident not to have some kind of this is the sort of thesis that SCI-Arc will accept, not to have that, but anything I do, if I do it in a robust way, that singular theme will be accepted. And I think there's enormous confidence in that. I think the school must support that. Yeah.
Well, I think also the technique of collecting, producing some kind of curated set, or as the student behind us said in his presentation, a menagerie, also feels very contemporary. Because, and I think one of the reasons that is so is actually the quite serious kind of crisis that we have projected on this younger generation, a crisis of agency. So, you know, if you feel like you're nearly powerless in the face of overwhelming disasters that are just rolling towards you like a giant tsunami, then one of the things that you can do to help fight back against that, you know, like Kant would say, there is something in the human breast that can rise up and resist, that kind of thing, is to produce a whole plethora of kind of other objects, other things that are arrayed with you, you know, against everything.
It's your little
else.
army that you're using.
It's your little army. It's your little proxies.
And I think also I want to bring up the question of technique.
3D printed armor.
Right, exactly. and kind of this notion of disciplinarity and also technique, because one thing that has struck me, I don't think I've seen a plan, or except for that one project, there was someone who used the plan as a kind of critique of the plan. But the kind of traditional tools of the architect that, plans, sections, and I think this is students are really embracing other techniques, other technologies as a way also to kind of confront these questions, like what do we do as architects now in the face of all of this, right?
Well, Tom Main made the point that the plan is gone because their first sketch is already three-dimensional. Right. So starting from the plan, the idea of extruding or starting from a plan and layering up, there's still the stacking projects, of course, but they aren't plan generated. They're still three-dimensionally generated.
Well, I always find it a bit funny and telling in a kind of an endearing way that it's usually the most seasoned among us that are can be over quick to make pronouncements about what's dead. And it was funny in that particular review that some of the kind of more seasoned voices in the room were like, I would say, first of all, the plan is still very much with us. And there are many types of architecture, maybe not the type that Tom Main does at Morphosis, that actually do still start from the plan. For instance, housing is very much still plan driven. But then in addition to that, I also think it's a bit there's a kind of fear sometimes of returning to the archive when you realize that you lived that archive. Right? The plan
for this generation of critics you're talking about?
The generation of, I just said something about this generation of students in a very generalizing way. So let me just say something super generalizing about critics. Right.
Yeah,
sure. Is that there's a recoil against that? Well, for younger people, like the students that are presenting their work, they don't have that baggage. And I think it's actually really cool that they can come and pick up some of those things that were so recently discarded and say, you know what, this is still part of architecture because I say so.
Oh, I think there's a lot of litter that, of detritus that is still quite available, and they do pick up some of it, yeah. Sure. Yeah. The one thing, maybe just not in any way to disagree with generally very high quality and diversity of work. There are some things I found missing, and one that I wish, it seems SCI-Arc would be very prepared to produce. And those are projects that, rather than use the kind of built-in Rhino, Boolean processes or the built-in kind of texture map and renders, is a project that tries to get behind that and hack the software to start making the software do things it doesn't want to do, or start finding the limits of software. I'm thinking of projects in the field not by students, but by young practitioners that deal with digital noise or the process of imaging to 3D and make intentionally producing glitches.
As a resistance to the kind of slickness we see so much of.
Exactly, as a resistance to slickness and completion, to actually find the glitches and gaps and make the software produce those as part of the project. I haven't seen many of those yet.
Right. It might be. I think it's happening. It might be that it's one or two. It's within the school for sure. I mean, I think that within the first and second year kind of programs here at the school, the students are, for example, in a second year core studio last semester, they didn't prepare any plans, any sections. It was like an esports arena that was all about how do they think about generating new audiences and how do they kind of hack very early into those software. So I think it's maybe true, particularly if I think of the reviews that you've been on. I think that they've been a bit more of like the sort of object, had a preference for that. But I also do think there are some advisors, even within this thesis group, that I think are working a lot on AI and things like that. And I think those are just inherently sort of about hacking the system.
So like so one of our younger faculty who is just this superstar, bizarre thinker. Love his work. I do not understand yet how it matters to the discipline, but I know it does. Damian Jovanovic, like what's always all of Damian's students took a type of convolutional neural net
I see.
and broke it in some way. to kind of make their own proposal for how that could be architectural. And in some cases it produced really bizarre stuff, and in some cases it produced weirdly banal stuff. But that conversation is actually one that SCI-Arc really has really entered in an intense way in the last couple of years.
That makes sense.
And
yeah.
I think it's also, though, the pressure just on a thesis generally, whatever school you're in, right? I think often students feel like they have to make something that is portfolio fabulous, and right, there's different kind of pressures, I think, on a thesis project, because you also feel somehow it should be a culmination of something, as opposed to a kind of set of questions or something that pushes or resists or is glitchy, right? I think they feel a pressure to make it complete.
And it's funny because actually that would be one of my critiques of the jury in general.
We were looking for
was that no, not like in general. I'm surprised that juries still spend so much time in the juridical model of say something, justify it, and I think that's kind of on us a little bit. Like we need to find other ways to approach projects where it's less to do with a kind of checking of the logic that then pushes people towards exactly those kinds of projects.
One project that we saw that I think there was an example of this, Michael and I think were on the jury with the augmented reality student, and that one I think was an example where the best part of that critique, I think, was we were able to say, you've kind of stepped into this really important, fascinating realm. None of us pretend to know what you should be doing here, but let's talk about kind of some ideas that you had, so how we might do it differently, but it wasn't like, here's your finished object, let's critique it against what you said. It's like, whoa, you've just ventured into this whole new world that we're all trying to figure out as architects how we should be. And I thought that was productive conversation, actually.
I think this was a productive conversation. Thank you.